Fear doesn't ask permission to move into your body and make itself at home in every nerve, every breath, every moment when you're supposed to be brave, but all you feel is the crushing weight of knowing that you're small, fragile, and completely unprepared for the war that's about to swallow you whole. Simon was just a cat. A scrawny black and white stray picked up from the docks of Hong Kong in 1948 by a 17-year-old sailor who saw something in those green eyes that reminded him of resilience. The kind that doesn't come from size or strength, but from something deeper, something that whispers, "I will not break," even when the entire world is designed to break you. Nobody knew that this unremarkable feline with torn ears and a tendency to steal food from the galley would become the only cat in history to receive a war medal, the only four-legged soul whose courage would be documented, honored, and remembered, while thousands of human heroes were forgotten in the footnotes of military history that cares more about strategy than it does about the silent guardians, who kept men sane when sanity was the rarest commodity on a warship trapped in enemy waters. The HMS Amethyst was supposed to be routine, a British frigate sailing up the Yangtze River in April 1949 to relieve another ship, and Simon was supposed to be what he'd always been, the ship's unofficial morale officer, the creature who would curl up next to homesick sailors and purr away their nightmares, who would chase rats through the hull and keep disease from spreading through a crew that was already living on the edge of desperation, in a place where every sunrise felt like a miracle, and every sunset felt like a countdown to something terrible. Nobody imagined that this routine mission would become a 100-day siege, that Chinese Communist forces would open fire with artillery that turned the ship into a floating morgue, that shells would rip through metal and flesh with the kind of indiscriminate violence that doesn't care if you're an officer or a sailor or a cat who was just trying to survive another day in a world that had already taught you that survival is never guaranteed, only earned through sheer stubborn refusal to surrender to the fear that wants to paralyze you into inaction. The blast that hit Simon should have killed him, shrapnel tearing through his small body, burns covering his skin, whiskers singed off, and yet somehow, impossibly, this creature who weighed less than 10 pounds dragged himself from the wreckage, bleeding and broken, and instead of hiding in some dark corner to die the way wounded animals are supposed to, he went back to work. He went back to hunting the rats that were multiplying in the damaged ship, threatening the food supplies that were already dwindling, spreading disease among men who were already dealing with injuries, infections, and the psychological warfare of being trapped under constant bombardment with no rescue in sight. Because the outside world had decided that saving one ship wasn't worth starting World War III. Simon, with his wounds still raw, with pain that must have been excruciating with every movement, continued to patrol the ship, continued to sleep next to the injured sailors, continued to exist as proof that even when you're shattered, even when every logical part of your being is screaming at you to give up, there's something in certain souls that simply refuses to quit, refuses to let fear win, refuses to accept that being small means being useless. The sailors watched this cat limp through the corridors, watched him catch rats despite his injuries, watched him purr through his own agony to comfort men who were 3 times his size and 100 times more capable of protecting themselves, and they understood something that no military training had taught them. That heroism isn't about size or species or even survival. It's about showing up when showing up is the hardest thing you could possibly do. It's about continuing to serve when you have every reason to hide. It's about being present for others when your own body is begging you to focus solely on staying alive. Simon became more than a mascot during those 100 days. He became a symbol, a living reminder that you don't have to be the biggest or the strongest or the most impressive to make a difference. You just have to be willing to do your job even when your job is killing you, even when nobody would blame you for curling up and waiting for the end. Even when fear has every logical reason to win, but you choose courage anyway because courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what needs to be done while fear is screaming in your ear that you're going to die, you're too small, you're too damaged, you're not enough. The British Admiralty awarded Simon the Dickin Medal, the animal equivalent of the Victoria Cross, the highest honor a creature could receive for military service. And they listed his actions. Disposing of rats despite his injuries, maintaining morale during the siege, surviving wounds that would have killed most animals, serving with distinction under fire. But what they couldn't list, what no official document could capture, was the way Simon's presence changed the psychological landscape of that ship. How men who were ready to give up found reasons to keep fighting. Because if a wounded cat could continue his duties, how could they do any less? How his existence became a rebuke to despair. A silent sermon that said, your size doesn't determine your worth. Your wounds don't disqualify you from service. Your fear doesn't have to define you even when you have every right to be terrified. The sailors would later say that Simon saved more lives than any weapon on that ship, not through violence but through persistence, not through strength, but through showing up day after day after day, when showing up required more courage than any human medal could adequately recognize or reward. Simon died in November 1949. Not from his war wounds directly, but from complications during the mandatory quarantine period that England required for all animals entering the country. His small body unable to fight both the lingering effects of his injuries and the stress of confinement after everything he'd endured, and the sailors who had served with him wept openly at his funeral. Hundreds of people attending the burial of a cat, because he wasn't just a cat anymore. He was proof that significance isn't measured in pounds or rank or the number of weapons you can carry. It's measured in the difference you make in the lives around you, in the courage you inspire simply by refusing to let your circumstances extinguish the light that makes you valuable, that makes you irreplaceable, that makes your existence matter in ways that echo long after your body returns to dust. His gravestone reads, "In memory of Simon, served in HMS Amethyst, awarded the Dickin Medal." But what it should say, what everyone who knew his story understands without needing words, is that he taught an entire ship's crew that heroism wears many faces, speaks many languages, comes in many sizes. And sometimes the bravest soul in the room is the smallest, the most wounded, the most overlooked, because that soul understands something that comfort never teaches, that courage is choosing to matter even when everything tells you that you're too insignificant to make any real difference in a war that's so much bigger than you could ever hope to be. The difficulty of conquering fear isn't about eliminating it, because fear is rational. Fear is your body's way of saying, this situation could kill you and you should probably run. But Simon didn't run. Not when the shells were falling, not when his body was broken, not when every instinct must have been screaming at him to find a hiding place and wait for death or rescue, whichever came first. He conquered fear by doing his job anyway, by being present anyway, by choosing purpose over panic even when panic was the most reasonable response to an unreasonable situation. And maybe that's what true courage looks like. Not the absence of terror, but the decision to function despite it, to serve despite it, to matter despite it, to refuse to let fear be the final word on who you are and what you're capable of contributing to a world that desperately needs every soul willing to stand up and say, I may be small, I may be wounded, I may be the least impressive creature in this situation, but I'm here, I'm showing up, and I'm going to do what I was meant to do until I physically can't anymore. You're not a cat, but you felt like Simon, haven't you? Standing in situations where you're outmatched, outgunned, too small for the battle you're in, wondering if anyone notices the effort it takes just to show up, wondering if your contribution even matters when there are so many bigger, stronger, more impressive people around you who seem to handle pressure without breaking, without limping, without the kind of wounds that nobody else can see but that you carry in every step, every breath, every moment, when you have to choose between giving up and giving one more ounce of whatever's left inside you. The truth that Simon's story whispers across decades is this: you don't have to be fearless to be brave. You don't have to be undamaged to be valuable. You don't have to be the biggest or the loudest or the most obvious hero in the story. You just have to keep showing up with whatever you have left, even if what you have left is barely enough to get through the next hour. Because sometimes surviving the next hour with purpose is more heroic than any grand gesture. Sometimes continuing to do the small things that need doing is more powerful than any dramatic sacrifice. Sometimes being faithful in the unremarkable moments is what separates those who merely endure from those who transform the people around them, simply by refusing to let their circumstances determine their worth. Simon conquered fear not by being unafraid, but by being more committed to his purpose than he was paralyzed by his terror. And maybe that's the lesson buried in this story of a cat who became a legend, that you don't need to wait until you feel brave to act bravely. You don't need to wait until your wounds heal to continue contributing. You don't need to wait until you're impressive to make an impression that lasts. You just need to decide that your presence matters, that your effort counts, that your willingness to keep going when quitting would be easier is precisely the kind of courage that changes worlds, saves lives, and proves that heroism isn't reserved for the strong, the loud, the obvious, but belongs to anyone willing to face their fear and serve anyway, bleed anyway, show up anyway, matter anyway, especially when the entire world has given you permission to disappear, and nobody would blame you for choosing survival over service, comfort over courage, fear over faith in the possibility that even you, small and wounded and unremarkable as you might feel, could be exactly what someone else needs to find their own reason to keep fighting, keep believing, keep hoping that if a scarred cat with burned whiskers could become a hero, then maybe, just maybe, so can they.